Vietnam is facing the fury of storm number 10, with relentless rain and devastating floods threatening homes and farms alike. Diem's peaceful farm is no exception, as rising waters and howling winds put everything at risk. Together with Toan, she races against time to secure livestock, reinforce buildings, and protect precious crops from being swept away by a potential flash flood. Will their farm survive nature's unstoppable force? Watch as courage, teamwork, and determination are tested like never before. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and follow Diem and Toan's gripping fight against the storm. Storm number 10 was sweeping across Vietnam with a fury that seemed almost unnatural, a relentless force of wind and rain that swallowed towns and villages in its path. From the coastal provinces to the inland lowlands, the skies had darkened to a bruised purple, and the clouds churned like an angry sea, threatening to pour down torrents of water at any moment. Streets that only yesterday had bustled with life were now rivers of murky brown, carrying debris, fallen branches, and the occasional overturned cart. Cars struggled against the current, their engines stuttering as water seeped in, while families huddled together on makeshift rafts or the roofs of their homes, praying for rescue. The cacophony of wind howling through broken windows and the distant roar of collapsing trees created an almost apocalyptic soundscape, one that left an indelible mark on anyone who dared to witness it. News reports flashed on every channel, each more alarming than the last. Bridges had collapsed in the north, highways were completely submerged in the central regions, and emergency shelters were overflowing with displaced families. Authorities issued urgent warnings. The rivers were swelling beyond their banks, and many areas were at high risk of flash floods and landslides. The images on the television screens showed entire neighborhoods submerged underwater, with only the tops of rooftops peeking above the liquid expanse. The countryside was no less affected. Paddy fields, once green and serene, had turned into vast lakes, swallowing everything in their path. Fruit orchards and vegetable patches, painstakingly nurtured for months, lay flattened under the weight of the storm. The nation was united in anxiety, each person bracing for what nature might unleash next. In the midst of this chaos, Diem's farm stood on the outskirts of a small town, a place usually known for its tranquility and lush greenery. But today, even the familiar calm of her fields could not shield her from the encroaching disaster. The wind tore through the trees, bending them almost to the ground, while sheets of rain hammered the roof and flooded the narrow pathways that led to the barn. Ponds and irrigation canals swelled rapidly, and Diem could already see signs that the low-lying areas of her property were beginning to fill with water. She walked along the edge of the main field, her boots sinking slightly in the increasingly saturated soil, scanning the horizon where the dark storm clouds merged with the rising floodwaters. Each gust of wind seemed stronger than the last, rattling the windows and making the barn doors tremble in their hinges. Her heart pounded not only with fear for her property, but also for the animal she had raised with such care. Chickens clucked in alarm as they huddled together under the eaves, while goats and cows stamped anxiously in their pens, sensing the danger. Diem's eyes traveled across the fields, taking in the vulnerable positions of her storage sheds, the fencing that might easily collapse under the pressure of the swelling water, and the delicate crops that, if flooded, would be destroyed beyond repair. It was a tense and almost surreal scene, the familiar landscape she had known since childhood transforming into a threatening, watery expanse in just a matter of hours. Even with all the warning signs, the reality of the storm's power was overwhelming. Diem felt a chill as she considered the possibility of a flash flood, a sudden torrent rushing down the nearby hills, capable of sweeping away everything in its path. The potential destruction was unimaginable. She knew the river behind her property was rising rapidly, and the saturation of the soil could trigger mudslides at any moment. In the distance, the wind carried the echo of collapsing structures and the distant cries of neighbors evacuating their homes, a grim reminder that no one was immune to the storm's wrath. Yet, in the face of all this, Diem remained alert and resolute. She understood that preparation, vigilance, and quick action were now the only shields against the disaster looming over her farm. As she took a deep breath, pushing the rain from her face, Diem felt both dread and determination intertwining in her chest. This was more than just a storm. It was a test of endurance, foresight, and courage. And as the storm surged closer, bringing with it the threat of total devastation, she knew that every second counted, that every decision she made in the coming hours could mean the difference between saving her home and losing it forever. The world around her was drowning in water and wind, but in the heart of the tempest, Diem was ready to face whatever came next. Diem's anxiety was mirrored in Toan's determined expression as he assessed the storm's growing threat to their farm. The rain had intensified into a relentless downpour, turning the muddy paths into slippery, treacherous trails. Each step was a calculated risk, as the water pooled deeper around their feet, carrying with it leaves, broken branches, and the occasional drift of soil. Together, they moved swiftly across the property, their minds racing through mental checklists, knowing that every second counted. The wind whipped through the tall grass, bending it almost to the ground, and gusts threatened to hurl loose objects across the fields like missiles. Toan's hands were steady, but Diem could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned every corner of the farm for vulnerabilities. They began by securing the livestock. The goats were moved to a higher, sturdier section of the barn where they could remain safe even if the lower pens flooded. Chickens, initially panicking at the sound of the storm, were herded into crates and elevated platforms, their soft clucks blending with the roar of the wind. Cows, larger and heavier, required more effort. They were guided toward reinforced areas of the barn with makeshift barricades placed strategically to prevent the animals from being swept away. Diem worked alongside Toan, pushing aside fear and fatigue as she lifted, carried, and barricaded. Her hands were raw from gripping wet ropes and shifting crates, but she didn't let go. Every small action felt monumental, each decision a potential safeguard against the oncoming disaster. Attention then turned to the crops and storage areas. The vegetable beds were drained as best as they could, trenches dug to divert the water from pooling too deeply. Fruit trees were checked, branches tied down, and stakes reinforced in a desperate effort to prevent them from toppling under the weight of the wind and water. Toan secured the grain storage, tying tarps tightly over the sacks of rice and corn, aware that even a small breach could result in catastrophic losses. Diem moved from one area to another, her mind working faster than her body, ensuring that fences were strong enough to hold against the surging water and that the most vulnerable structures were reinforced. Each task was exhausting, but they knew that failing to act now would result in devastation beyond repair. As they worked, the storm's power became increasingly apparent. The river that ran behind the property had risen to a dangerous height, and its murky waters now lapped at the edges of the lower fields. Rainwater collected in depressions, forming fast-moving channels that threatened to erode the soil beneath their feet. Diem paused for a moment, looking at the churning water, her heart tightening as she imagined a sudden flash flood sweeping through their land, carrying away the barn, the animals, and the fruits of their labor. Toan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, offering silent strength, but neither could hide the unspoken truth. If the flood hit hard, the damage could be devastating, potentially undoing years of dedication in a matter of hours. Despite the looming danger, the two pressed on, their teamwork seamless, almost instinctive. Diem relayed instructions, checked on barricades, and adjusted the placement of equipment, while Toan reinforced the structural weak points, ensuring that the farm could withstand as much of the storm's fury as possible. Every gust that shook the trees, every flash of lightning, every distant crash of falling debris was a reminder of how fragile their efforts could be against nature's might. Yet within the storm's chaos, there was also a sense of unity and resilience. They were not powerless. They were acting, fighting to protect their home and everything they cherished. As night began to fall, the rain showing no sign of letting up, Diem and Toan took a brief moment to assess their work. The barn was fortified, the animals safe for now, and the most vulnerable areas of the property had been reinforced. Exhaustion weighed heavily on their bodies, but in their eyes burned a quiet determination. The storm could rage as it pleased, but they would not surrender easily. The farm was their life, their memories, and their dreams, and together they would face the oncoming flood with courage, vigilance, and an unbreakable bond, hoping that when the storm passed, they could still stand strong amid the devastation. As night deepened, the storm showed no mercy. Rain continued to pour in relentless sheets, blurring the edges of the farm and turning every familiar path into a dangerous river. The wind screamed through the trees, bending them almost to the ground, and lightning illuminated the chaotic scene in brief, harsh flashes. Diem and Toan, exhausted yet undeterred, moved from one critical spot to another, ensuring that the livestock remained safe, the barns secured, and the most vulnerable crops as protected as possible. The possibility of a flash flood still loomed ominously over the low-lying fields, and every second that passed felt like a test of their endurance. They worked with methodical urgency. Diem double-checked the elevated pens for the goats and chickens, reinforcing weak points with whatever materials were at hand. Toan inspected the barns once more, tightening loose planks and securing doors that threatened to collapse under the storm's fury. Puddles had begun to form inside storage areas despite their best efforts, and Diem frantically moved supplies to higher ground, stacking sacks of grain and crates of vegetables where the water could not reach. Each task was physically draining, yet they found strength in their shared determination. They spoke little, communicating mostly through gestures and brief commands, their focus entirely on survival. The river behind the property had risen to a terrifying height. Murking waters surged closer to the fields, and Diem could hear the distant, unsettling roar of it colliding with embankments. The soil underfoot had become treacherous, threatening to give way at any moment. She imagined the potential devastation, a sudden surge sweeping through the farm, carrying away barns, fences, and years of hard work in a matter of minutes. It was a reality too painful to visualize fully, yet they could not ignore it. They had to act, and they did, pouring every ounce of energy into protective measures, refusing to succumb to fear. Hours passed, and though fatigue gnawed at them relentlessly, Diem and Toan maintained their vigil. They checked on the animals repeatedly, spoke words of reassurance, and adjusted the barriers as needed. Each gust of wind that rattled the trees reminded them of the storm's might, but also of the necessity of their resolution. Even in the darkest moments, there was a quiet sense of hope, a belief that careful preparation could save what was precious to them. Their bond, already strong, deepened further under the strain of shared hardship, each action reinforcing not only the farm, but also the trust and commitment between them. By the early hours of the morning, the rain had begun to ease slightly, though the river remained swollen and the fields partially submerged. Diem and Toan paused to survey the results of their tireless efforts. The barns held firm, the animals were safe, and although parts of the crops were damaged, the most important areas had survived. Their clothes were soaked, their bodies aching, yet a quiet triumph glimmered in their eyes. They had faced nature's wrath together and had, against the odds, preserved much of what mattered most. In that moment, amidst the lingering rain and the battered but standing farm, Diem and Toan understood the true power of resilience, teamwork, and courage. The storm had tested them beyond limits, but it had not broken them. Their hearts swelled with relief, gratitude, and a renewed determination to rebuild and protect their farm. The danger had passed, but the lessons of storm number 10, the fragility of life, the unpredictability of nature, and the strength found in unity would remain with them forever.
Hello, xin chào tất cả các khán giả của kênh Lý Tử Diễm Review. Vậy là cơn bão số 10 sắp tràn vào Việt Nam có nguy cơ gây ra lũ lụt và sạt lở. Cho nên trang trại của Diễm có nguy cơ sẽ bị sập hoàn toàn và bị lũ quét. Đứng trước nguy cơ đó thì Toàn và Diễm đang phải gấp rút chằng chống để giúp cho trang trại của Diễm vượt qua cơn bão này. Liệu rằng trang trại của Diễm có trụ được qua cơn bão hay không, hay là sẽ bị thiệt hại rất là nặng nề. Tất cả sẽ được hé lộ vào các tập tiếp theo, sẽ được phát sóng hàng ngày trên kênh Lý Tử Diễm Review. Các bạn hãy đón xem nhé. Các bạn đừng quên hãy bấm nút đăng ký để nhận được thông báo mới nhất về các video sẽ được đăng tải trên kênh. Cảm ơn các bạn rất nhiều. Xin chào và hẹn gặp lại. Bye bye.